Before Europe knew about America, millions of people already lived on the other side of the world. They had cities, armies, temples, roads. But one mistake, one person's mistake, changed their destiny forever. In this video, we will tell you how Columbus was not actually looking for America and did not know that he had found it. Why was his expedition called crazy? And who decided to give him ships? What did he see when he first set foot on the shores of a new continent? How did his voyage lead to wars, epidemics, and the disappearance of entire civilizations? This story is not only about geography, it is a story about how greed, faith, and curiosity can rewrite the map of the world and the destinies of millions of people. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep stories are published here every day. Make yourself comfortable. We are beginning. Before Europe said the word America, it already existed, not as an empty land or a nameless continent waiting to be discovered, but as a complex and living world inhabited by tens of millions of people. It had its own civilizations, its own empires, its own laws. In the north, in the valleys of the future United States, lived tribes who built earthen mounds as tall as multi-story buildings. They traded, grew crops, and they had rituals that were preserved for centuries. Further south, the cities of Maya rose up, with hieroglyphs on the walls of temples and star maps on stone slabs. On the plateau of Mexico, an empire of Aztecs grew, with markets where thousands of people gathered daily, with an army, a palace, schools, a water supply system, and laws divided into categories of crimes. And even further south, in the Andes Mountains, the Inca Empire developed without writing, but with an ideal road network, a system of accounting on knotted cords, and a centralized administration that covered thousands of kilometers. America before Columbus is not a myth about wild tribes. These are living societies in which people married, quarreled, prayed, fought, and healed. Each nation had its own gods, its own legends, its own explanations of the structure of the world. They were not the same. Some believed in the kingdom of the dead underground, somewhere in the connection with animals, somewhere in the great sun. But they were similar in one thing. None of them knew that another world, unknown to them, existed beyond the ocean. But Europe knew, or at least guessed. In the minds of medieval Europeans, the world ended either at the sea or a wall of sand, at best at a cliff with monsters and black winds. But closer to the 15th century, fear of the horizon gradually began to give way to interest. It all started in the East. In the Middle Ages, the East was synonymous with wealth. Pepper, cinnamon, silk, jade, sugar, and porcelain were brought to Europe from India and China. But the journey there was long and dangerous. Caravans crossed dozens of borders, where each ruler set his own duty. After the capture of Constantinople by the Ottoman Empire, this route became almost inaccessible. The Portuguese, obsessed with the idea of going around Africa, spent decades paving the way along its coast. They built trading posts, went further and further south, hoping to one day turn east and reach India by sea. This was a path of real calculations, through a spit, monsoons, harbors, dangers. It required patience and money. But there was another idea, bolder and more or less proven. What if the earth is round, and the route to India lies not to the east, but to the west? It seemed crazy. Many scientists really believed that the earth is a sphere, but they thought that the ocean between Europe and Asia was too big. However, there were those who believed that there was not so much water between Europe and Asia, or maybe there was land somewhere there. In those years, legends circulated in Europe about wonderful islands beyond the horizon, about the land of saints, about golden cities where the roofs were covered with jewels and the rivers were full of spices. They talked about Saint Brendan, who allegedly sailed across the ocean and reached Eden. There were stories about Vikings, who once found themselves in Vinland, a rich land beyond the sea. These rumors were not perceived as a map, but fed the imagination. The less knowledge there was, the more powerful the myths were. They did not interfere, but on the contrary, pushed forward. When there are not enough facts, fear is replaced by hope. Inside this hope lived the idea that the ocean could be crossed, that there would be earth on the other shore, that it was possible not to perish, but to get rich. At that moment, fear and greed began to work together. The fear of being cut off from sources of goods, of being left on the sidelines of world trade. The greed to gain access to all this directly, without intermediaries. And there was also vanity. Whoever had their own trade route would become the strongest power. Curiosity, greed, fear, and legends came together. Someone was looking for gold. Someone wanted to find the boundaries of the world, and someone wanted to prove that the horizon is not an obstacle. And so a request for a map appeared, which did not yet exist. First in mines, then in papers, then in ports, and finally in sails. Everything that happened next was a consequence of these expectations, guesses, illusions, and the belief that beyond the horizon there is not emptiness, but opportunity. An opportunity to see what is not visible from here. An opportunity to be the first to reach the shore that no one knows by name. And while on the other side of the ocean, people were harvesting, hunting, praying, and making sacrifices to their gods, in Europe, the first expedition was already being prepared. The worlds did not yet know each other, but soon their clash would change both. At the end of the 10th century, Europe stood on the threshold of a new stage. In Spain, the Reconquista was completed. The last Moorish colony of Granada surrendered. The Catholic monarchs, Isabella Costilska and Ferdinand of Antaragon, finally united the country, cleared the treasury, and began to think about the future. In the same year, a man appeared again at the Spanish court who for many years had been trying to convince kings of one single idea. The way to India can be found if you sail west. His name was Christopher Columbus. He was born in Genoa into a simple weaver's family. In his youth, he went to sea, worked as a merchant, studied maps, and drew navigation charts himself. He did not have a university education, but he had rare persistence. His idea, in fact, was based on a mistake. He greatly underestimated the size of the Earth and did not know that there was an entire continent between Europe and Asia. But he believed that if you leave Spain and head strictly west, you can sail to the shores of Asia. At first, he was ridiculed. His ideas were rejected in Portugal. In England and France, they did not even listen to him. Only in Spain did he find support. A monk named Juan Perez played a key role, persuading Queen Isabella to give Columbus another chance. She agreed. A contract was signed. Columbus received the title of admiral, the right to govern future lands, and a share of all the riches he would find. In May, preparations began. 3 small ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña, were moored in the port of Polos de la Frontera. They were modest in size, without much protection, and not designed for a long ocean voyage. The crew was recruited with difficulty. People were afraid. There were rumors that there was emptiness beyond the horizon, a cliff, monsters, magnets that could pull nails out of boards. In the end, the team was assembled. Most did not follow the call of their hearts. Some went to avoid prison, others because they were promised forgiveness or money. The sailors did not know exactly where they were sailing. They were told, to India. But the map they were following was just a guess. No one had crossed this route before them. On the morning of August 3rd, 1492, the flotilla set out to sea. The farewell was short. No fireworks, no songs. No one believed they would return. At first, their course took them to the Canary Islands. There they replenished supplies and repaired the Pinta. Her rudder had broken before they left Spain. Then they went out into the open ocean. This was the part of the journey no one knew. With each passing week, the horizon became empty. The wind did not change. The sun carried heat. The men began to get nervous. Many began to write down the days on the walls. Some asked to turn around. Columbus kept a diary, but he wrote down underestimated distances so that the crew would think they were not that far from home. Every night, they peered into the sky. There was no indication that the path was correct. Not a single familiar shore. Not a single boat they met. Sometimes birds landed on the water. Sometimes seaweed floated out to sea. Columbus said, "This is a sign that land is near." But the land did not appear. One day, strange lightning appeared in the sky. In the evening, the compass began to behave differently. The needle deviated. Some thought that they had lost their way, that the world beyond had already begun to collapse. One of the sailors said that perhaps the ocean was endless. Columbus was silent, but inside he also doubted. A month later, the unrest became obvious. The sailors began to talk about mutiny. The people were tired. They did not understand where they were. They had no map, only the faith of the captain and the silence of the ocean. Columbus promised that if there was no land in a few days, they would turn back. And yet, on October 10th, birds began to circle above the ships more often. On the morning of October 11th, branches and tree fragments appeared on the water, and at night at about 2 o'clock, a cry rang out from the watch. "Land!" They did not know what exactly they had found. They did not know that this was not Asia at all. But for them, this was the end of the journey. They had crossed seas that were not on any map, and now they stood before a shore that would change the course of history forever. On the morning of October 12th, as the sun slowly rose above the horizon, Columbus's 3 ships approached the shore of an unknown land. The watchman of the Pinta was the first to notice a shadow on the water. Then he made out the silhouettes of trees. Columbus ordered the boats to be lowered. He was in full dress uniform. With the flag of Castile, with a letter from the Queen, and with the thought that he had reached Asia, they landed on one of the Bohemian islands. The name that the locals gave, Columbus wrote down as Guanahani. He did not understand their language, but this did not bother him. He was sure that this was one of the islands off the coast of India. Later, he wrote in his diary that the island was inhabited by kind, gentle, unarmed people who obeyed easily. On that first day, Columbus raised the flag of Spain, declaring these lands the property of the Catholic monarchs. He did not ask the locals whose lands they considered the island to be. He believed that he had arrived in the lands that he was destined to discover and rule. The natives came to the shore. They had no metal, no clothing in the usual sense. They offered gifts, feathers, beads, food. They did not understand who these people with white skin and iron things were, and they certainly did not know that with their appearance, everything would change. Columbus took their gesture as a sign of recognition of power. He decided that they were Indians because he thought he was in India. This name would remain with them forever, despite the geographical error. In the following days, the flotilla moved from island to island. They were looking for gold. Columbus was not interested in the climate, culture, or customs, but in where the mines were, where the jewelry was mined, what people wore jewelry. He asked questions, pointed at objects, drew with gestures. They answered him, but he understood them freely. On one of the islands, he met people who had small gold pendants. They explained that further to the south, there was land where there was even more gold. Columbus remembered this. He wrote, "If these people know gold, then there is a lot of it here. If they do not resist, then they can be converted to Christianity and used in the economy." His first impression of the locals was ambivalent. On the one hand, he wrote that they were hospitable, open, unarmed. On the other, that they could easily be made servants and taught Spanish. He did not see them as allies, but as a resource. Meanwhile, the crew was getting used to the new shores. They were trying local fruits for the first time, encountering plants they didn't know. There was tobacco, there were potatoes, there were parrots, palm trees, and heat they weren't used to. Many were surprised and, at the same time, afraid. The land was beautiful, but incomprehensible. Columbus wrote that there were no dangerous animals, no cities. no army. He was wrong. He simply hadn't reached the places where strong societies lived yet. He was on the edge of the continent, but he thought he had already reached its heart. He wrote that everything was under control, that the natives recognized his authority, that the mission was close to success. In reality, he didn't understand the language, the political system, or the beliefs of the local peoples. He didn't know that this was only the first step. He didn't know that further on were the islands of the Caribbean, and then the continent with a 1,000-year history. He didn't know that this world was much more complex than it seemed from the shore. The ship sailed on. In November, they reached Cuba. Columbus was sure it was a continent. He sent a group deep into the island to find palaces and temples. They found neither, but they brought back stories of an amazing plant that the locals smoked. Its leaves were dried, rolled into tubes, and set on fire. That was how Europe first learned about tobacco. Then there was Hispaniola, an island that is today shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic. There, Columbus decided to build the first settlement. Before his eyes, the Santa Maria ran aground and crashed. A fort was built from the wreckage. Several dozen people remained there. The first European colony in America. Columbus and the others returned to Spain. He took some gold with him, exotic things, a few captured natives, and most importantly, news. He believed that he had reached India, that the route was open, that now it was possible to establish trade. In his letters, he wrote about wonderful lands, about good people, about a great mission. He did not know that his first steps laid the foundation for a long chain of invasions. He did not know that the first gifts would be followed by guns, and the missionaries by soldiers. He did not know that for these islands, this was not a discovery, but the beginning of the end. Returning to Spain in the spring of 1493, Columbus found himself in the center of attention. He was greeted as a man who had discovered a new route to India, although in fact, he never understood where exactly he had been. His ship moored at ports with cages, in which sat people with dark skin and feathers in their hair. The 3 baskets contained corn, cotton, shiny stones, unusual fruits, bright parrots. But what attracted the most attention were the gold pendants, even if there were only a few of them. The royal court greeted him with honors. They called him the Admiral of the Ocean Sea, and they spoke of him with admiration. He reported that he had discovered many islands, rich in nature and suitable for conversion to Christianity. He assured that there was incomparably more gold on these lands than they managed to bring. He swore that if he were given more ships and people, he would discover inexhaustible wealth. Isabella and Ferdinand believed him. His promises coincided with their hopes. Power, money, glory. All this was within reach. He was allowed to organize a second expedition, but this time everything was different. The first time he sailed with 3 modest ships, the second time with a flotilla of 17 ships and more than 1,000 people on board. Among them were not explorers, but artisans, soldiers, officials, priests. This was no longer an expedition, but a colonization. They set out in the fall of '93. Soon they arrived at Hispaniola, where a garrison was left, but the fort built from the rubble of the Santa Maria lay in ruins. Those who remained were dead. The reasons are not exactly known. Perhaps a quarrel with the locals, perhaps internal strife. Columbus decided to start over. He founded a new settlement, La Navidad, then another Isabella. He tried to establish administration, establish control, organize gold mining, but there was little gold. What the locals wore as jewelry had no relation to real deposits. He sent detachments into the interior of the island, collected information, but there were no large finds. Nevertheless, he continued to believe, or pretend to believe, in mountains of gold. He used force. He set quotas for gold collection, demanded that locals bring him a certain number of grains of sand. For failure to comply, there was punishment. The first chains appeared, the first people hanged, the first uprisings. Meanwhile, in Spain, they were waiting for results, waiting for gold, waiting for ships full of riches. Instead, news came of troubles, of poor management, of cruelty. Complaints began. Discontent grew among the settlers. There was not enough food, diseases were spreading, discipline was collapsing. Columbus could not cope. He was a navigator, but not an administrator. He did not know how to manage a colony, how to resolve conflicts, how to build stable relationships with the locals. He believed that he would find gold, and this would solve all the problems. He was wrong. He went on exploring new islands. He reached Jamaica and part of Cuba. Everywhere he looked for signs of India, spices, spicy aromas. He asked the locals if they had a king, if they had elephants, if they had peppers. They did not understand what he wanted, and he did not understand that he was in a completely different world. Despite the chaos, in 1496, he returned to Spain again, this time without triumph. Rumors of cruelty, reprisals, failures followed him. He was still accepted, but now with restraint. His authority began to crack, but he persuaded, "Give me another chance." He promised to find again what did not exist. The third expedition, 2 years later, brought him to the shores of South America, the mouth of the Orinoco. There, for the first time, Columbus began to suspect that he might not be in Asia. The river was too full, the plants too unfamiliar, the people too different. He wrote in letters, "I feel that this land is part of paradise." But he did not publicly renounce his theory. He could not admit his mistake. Meanwhile, a crisis was growing in Hispaniola. The Spaniards demanded power. The locals rebelled. Complaints went straight to Madrid. In 1500, the monarchs sent an official with a special mission to arrest Columbus and take him to Spain. He was chained. Thus ended his power over the colony. He was released but no longer received real support. In 1502, he went to sea again. This was his last expedition. He reached the shores of Central America, looked for a passage to the Indian Ocean, vainly hoping to prove that his theory was correct. He did not find a passage, did not find gold, did not found a single city. His ships were damaged by storms. He spent months in isolation, waiting for help. In 1504, he returned to Spain, old, sick, deceived by his own illusions. He asked for his promises, titles and shares, to be returned to him. But Queen Isabella died, and Ferdinand no longer listened. Columbus died 2 years later, never knowing that he had discovered not a new route to Asia, but an entire continent. His life became a symbol of the dual beginning of a new era. He sought spices and palaces, but found wild shores. He promised gold, but brought violence. He thought he had a map, but found himself on foreign soil without a compass. And yet his path became a starting point. Ahead were conquistadors, diseases, ships, wars, treaties, colonies. But the first to enter this scene was a man who sought one thing, found another, and did not understand what exactly he had discovered. The discovery of America was not just a new line in navigation diaries. It caused a chain reaction that no one predicted. What began as a search for a route to India turned into a complete restructuring of the world. Geography changed its outline. Maps were rewritten. But most importantly, the logic of history itself changed. After Columbus returned, the race began. Following the Spaniards, the Portuguese, the English, and the French rushed to the New World, some with royal decrees, others with personal greed. Some wanted gold, others land, others souls. Everyone wanted their own, and everyone believed they had the right to it. Spain quickly divided the world in half. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed. According to it, everything west of the imaginary line went to Spain, everything east to Portugal. No one asked about the locals. They did not participate in negotiations. Their existence was taken into account as part of the natural landscape, like forests, rivers, and ore. Settlements began to grow on the islands of the Caribbean. Each new governor promised more income. Gold became a goal, a meaning, a measure. Where it was not found, people were forced to work. Where it was found, people were killed for refusing to share. Local communities were destroyed. Some fled, others fought, others surrendered. But none of these strategies saved them. Others followed Columbus. Hernán Cortés landed in Mexico in 1519. He had a little over 600 soldiers. The Aztec army, the capital, the rituals, the walls, the temples, and yet Tenochtitlan fell. Why? Because the Spanish were cruel. Yes, because they had weapons too. But most importantly, because they brought with them something no one expected. Viruses, smallpox, measles, flu, typhus, diseases that were unknown in the New World. The Indians had no immunity. One infected person, and thousands died. Sometimes entire villages disappeared in a matter of weeks. This was not a war in the usual sense. It was an epidemic, hidden in tissues and breath. Historians estimate that by the middle of the 15th century, the indigenous population of the Caribbean islands had decreased by 90%. While this was happening, ships with trophies were sailing to Europe. Ingots, fabrics, exotic fruits, shells, tobacco, Indians in chains. The Old World greedily absorbed everything new. Oranges and corn became commonplace. Potatoes entered the diet of the poor, and with them, the belief that at the edge of the world, there was an inexhaustible resource. Spain became the first global empire. Gold from America filled its treasury, but along with it came conflicts, corruption, religious intolerance. Churches were built on the conquered lands, but camps were nearby. Forced Christianization was underway. Those who refused to be baptized became slaves. The encomienda system allowed the Spaniards to take care of the locals while receiving the right to their labor. In fact, it was a form of slavery. Soon, there were not enough Indians. Then the next stage began, the import of Africans. Slaves were brought across the Atlantic, sending back sugar, tobacco, gold. Thus, the Triangle of Death was formed: Europe, Africa, America. But even those who did not participate in the conquests directly felt the changes. In England, a fleet was built. In France, trading companies were founded. New markets, new spices, new diseases, new beliefs appeared. The world economy began to form, not in theory, but on decks. And what happened in America? Languages disappeared, temples collapsed, manuscripts burned. Where cities had recently stood, there were now pastures. People who had lived by their own laws for centuries suddenly found themselves subjects of a foreign king. Their gods were forbidden, their bodies not their property. The conquistadors who came after Columbus no longer pretended to be explorers. They came as conquerors. They had manifestos, bulls, charters. They referred to God, but they acted in the name of gold. Everyone aspired to be the next Columbus, not in geography, but in profit. In Europe, his name became a symbol of victory. In America, a symbol of the end. The discovery was not a door to a new era, but a punch in the jaw to those who already lived on this land. And it all began with a map that did not exist, with the idea that India was closer than it seemed, with the illusion that the Earth was just a globe with edges. But it turned out that the Earth is living people, and the discovery of their lands is not a neutral act, but an invasion. Columbus did not know what exactly he had started, but his step was the first in a series of events that still cannot be washed away. Because history is not only what is written in diaries, it is also what is burned, erased, forgotten. And in the case of America, these are millions of voices that no one will hear anymore. With each decade after the first landing on the island of Guanahani, the meaning of the name, Christopher Columbus, became more and more symbolic. His real life, with all its failures, requests, exiles, and losses, was gradually supplanted by the image of a hero who discovered a new world. His path was presented as a moment of triumph for the European spirit, courage, and faith. But was it really so? Columbus died in poverty and oblivion. His titles were taken away, his income was cut. His sons sued the crown for many years, demanding the return of what was promised. He himself never knew that he had discovered a new continent. Until the end of his life, he claimed that he had found the route to East Asia, but what he did not understand in life became the basis of a historical myth. After his death in the 15th to 17th centuries, when Europe was forming its picture of the world, the figure of Columbus turned out to be convenient. One man, one voyage, one date. It looked clear, obvious, impressive. The discovery of the continent was reduced to one name. The complex reality, in which millions of people already lived in America, did not fit into a convenient scheme. There was no place for the Mayans, the Incas, the Cherokees, the Mohawks. Their history was too restless, too contradictory. It was easier to omit it and exalt the figure of Columbus. In American schools of the 19th century, Columbus was presented as founder. Cities, states, and universities were named in his honor. In 1792, 300 years after his first voyage, the first monuments were erected in the United States. In the 20th century, Columbus Day became an official holiday. The fact that he did not discover empty land, but entered it without permission, was not talked about. But time passed, and by the beginning of the 21st century, the myth began to crack. Historians ask themselves, why do we say discovered if millions of people lived here before? Why do we celebrate the date when the destruction of entire nations began? Why do we ignore the consequences, calling this event exceptionally great? In Latin America, Columbus Day was renamed the Day of Indigenous Resistance in some countries. In some places, it was completely canceled. In others, it was replaced by the Day of Cultural Diversity. People began to reconsider their views. Monuments became a subject of debate. Some saw them as a memory, others as a symbol of injustice. But it is not even about the figure of Columbus. He became a screen onto which the meaning of the era is projected. He is like the cover of a book that few open. Columbus was looking for one thing, found another, understood a third. But his journey became the beginning of a global exchange that changed the climate, economy, agriculture, religion, and demography. Europe received potatoes, corn, tomatoes, and chocolate. America, diseases, slavery, iron, and the gospel. All this did not happen in one day, not in one decade, but began at the moment when 3 ships approached the shore. Therefore, the question is not whether Columbus was a hero or a villain, but why we continue to tell this story as if it were simple. Why do we look for a single meaning in it? Why do we continue to call it a discovery, knowing that it cost someone their life, their land, their name? History doesn't have to be comforting. Sometimes it's rough, sometimes it's cruel, sometimes it's illogical, but it's ours. And to understand how we got to where we are today, we need to be able to see not only the heroes, but also those who disappeared from the lines of textbooks, not only the path of the ship, but also the trace it left on the shore. Thanks for listening.